You want to own a funeral home. Quiet building, few viewing rooms, some flowers, a steady stream of families who have nowhere else to go. It sounds almost recession-proof. Death doesn't care about the economy. Every single person alive today will, eventually, generate exactly one transaction for this industry. That's the pitch you've probably heard, and on the surface, it sounds like the safest business there is. Here's the problem. You're thinking about this business the way you'd think about a grocery store. More customers, more revenue, done. But a funeral home isn't selling a product to someone comparing prices in a parking lot. It is selling an irreversible decision to someone who is not thinking clearly on the worst day of their life under a deadline measured in hours. Once you understand that single fact, everything about how this business makes money and how it can just as easily fail starts to make sense. Let's start with what it costs to open the door, because the number in your head is almost certainly wrong. There isn't one kind of funeral home. There are at least 3 wearing the same black suit. At the low end, the direct cremation provider, a small office, a relationship with a crematory, minimal staff. In the middle, the traditional full-service home, viewing rooms, a chapel, a fleet of vehicles, embalming facilities. At the top, the funeral home attached to its own cemetery, selling not just the service, but the ground underneath it.
Each is a different bet on the same question. Do you make your money from a high volume of low-cost transactions or a smaller number of families paying for the full arrangement? That decision shapes every number that follows. Now, the part almost nobody budgets correctly. You'd think the expensive part is the building. It isn't. The expensive part is the license to legally handle a human body and the infrastructure to prove you can do it safely. A funeral director's license typically requires a mortuary science degree, a lengthy apprenticeship, and a state board exam, a process that can take 2 to 4 years before you're even legally allowed to run the place. The embalming room needs specialized ventilation, health department-grade drainage, and equipment that can run $15,000 to $50,000 just to get certified. A hydraulic embalming table alone costs $3,000 to $10,000. Refrigeration units to hold remains before services run another $10,000 to $30,000. Then there's the fleet. A used hearse runs $30,000 to $80,000, and a full-service operation typically needs at least 1 hearse and 1 family limousine. Add licensing, insurance specifically for handling human remains, its own liability category most general policies won't touch, and a cash reserve to survive the slow early months, and a modest full-service home can require $500,000 to well over $1.5 million just to open before a single family walks through the door. Now, equipment that never shows up in the brochure. Caskets. You'd assume the funeral home just orders what the family picks and marks it up reasonably. Here's the number that surprises people. Wholesale cost on a mid-range casket runs $500 to $2,000. Retail price to the family routinely lands between $2,000 and $10,000. That's a markup of 200 to 400%, sometimes more, one of the most consistent margins in retail anywhere in America. Location math works differently here than in almost any other business. It's not foot traffic, it's the local death rate, plainly. A funeral home's addressable market is the annual number of deaths within its service area, and that number is remarkably stable, tied almost entirely to the age distribution of the surrounding population. An older median age is, in blunt economic terms, a better location. This is one of the only businesses where you can build a 5-year forecast off census data with genuine accuracy. Now we get to the part that explains everything else, the hidden mechanism underneath this entire industry. A family arranging a funeral is, in nearly every case, doing so within 24 to 72 hours of a death, often overnight, often for the first time in their lives, often still in shock. They are not shopping 4 different homes and comparing itemized price sheets, even though federal law requires every home to hand them one. They are sitting across a desk from a calm, professional stranger, gently suggesting the better casket, the more appropriate package, the upgrade that honors their loved one properly.
And here's the number that makes the model click. Industry surveys consistently show most families spend more than they originally planned, often significantly more, and almost none of them negotiate. Think about why. Haggling over the price of your mother's casket in front of a funeral director a day after she died feels obscene. The emotional cost of negotiating is so high that most people would rather overpay than appear to be putting a price on grief. This isn't an accident the industry stumbled into. It's the single most important economic fact underpinning the business, and everything from showroom layout to the order caskets are presented in is quietly built around it.
The Federal Trade Commission has known this for decades. In 1984, it introduced the funeral rule, requiring an itemized price list for anyone who asks and banning a handful of aggressive practices, like requiring embalming that isn't legally necessary. The rule exists because regulators recognized grief itself was being used as a sales mechanism, and it hasn't fully closed the gap. Compliance sweeps still regularly find homes failing to disclose prices properly, decades later. There's a seasonal wrinkle too, though it isn't January resolutions here, it's winter. Mortality spikes in the colder months, flu season, holiday-related cardiac events, icy roads. A funeral home can see 20 to 30% more call volume in January and February than in the quieter summer months. Owners who don't plan staffing and refrigeration capacity around that swing get caught flat-footed exactly when demand is highest and families are least patient. There's also a structural choice underneath all of this: standalone home or pre-need contracts. Pre-need is where a living person pays in advance for their own eventual funeral, locking in today's price. This sounds like free money up front, and in the short term it is, but that cash usually has to be placed into a state-regulated trust or insurance product, not spent on operations. States require anywhere from 70 to 100% of pre-need payments to be held in trust, specifically because of a long, ugly history of funeral homes collecting the money and then failing before the person died. Mishandled pre-need trusts are one of the most common reasons state regulators shut a funeral home down entirely. Here's where the math becomes brutal in a different direction: cremation. 20 years ago, cremation was the discount option nobody wanted to discuss. Today, cremation rates in the U.S. have crossed 60% nationally and are still climbing. That single shift has quietly gutted the traditional revenue model. A cremation-only transaction might bring in $1,500 to $3,000. A full traditional service with casket, viewing, and burial can bring in $10,000 to $15,000 or more. An owner who built their cost structure, the embalming room, the fleet, the large chapel around the traditional model, is now watching a growing share of their market choose the version that barely covers overhead.
This is why so many established funeral homes have quietly added cremation gardens, keepsake urn lines, and celebration of life event packages. Not because taste changed, but because the industry needed a way to rebuild margin on top of a service that used to be a footnote. Now, can this business fail despite feeling untouchable? Yes, and the reason is almost always the same: over-leveraged consolidators. Large funeral corporations spent decades buying up small family-owned homes, financing the acquisitions with debt, betting that steady death rates would guarantee steady cash flow to service that debt. It mostly worked until rising interest rates or a shift like the cremation surge hit at the same time debt payments came due. The business itself never stopped having customers. It failed because the math connecting acquisition debt to actual incoming revenue broke down, the exact same structural trap that sunk gym chains, hotel groups, and retailers that looked unstoppable from the parking lot. So how does a funeral home actually make money in plain terms? Average revenue per family served times number of families minus fixed costs, the license infrastructure, the fleet, the building, the staff. If a home serves 150 families a year at an average of $8,000 each, that's $1.2 million in revenue against fixed costs that might run $600,000 to $800,000 depending on the market.
The margin isn't in the volume of grief walking through the door. It's in the gap between what something costs and what a person in shock is willing to pay without asking why.